Yes. Sorry.
No, I'm tempted to come here and say I'll talk about Cornish wine. It's very good. It is very good. Well, thank you very much, Natalie. Thank you, Martin, for having me. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's wonderful to be back here. It's my third visit to this centre and to the university, and it is going to be my last. I leave in December, so thank you for having me. It's my first visit, though, since the vote last year by the British people to leave the European Union. And so, yes, I am going to talk about Brexit. I'll talk, I think, for about 15-20 minutes and then turn it over to questions, because I think that's always the better way to do things. So thank you for coming. A little bit of context first. It's always interesting to think about the UK's history with the EU and put it in a historical context. Those of you who are studying the EU, I'm sure you appreciate that. The EU is first and foremost a political construct. And many of the countries that joined the EU, the vast majority of countries that joined the EU, did so to cement and entrench their democracy. Democracies that were in many cases very young. So if you look at the origins of the EU or the European communities as it was at the time in the 1950s, the first 6 founder members had just come out of the Second World War. If you look at the 80s, you had Greece, Portugal and Spain join in the aftermath of dictatorships. And then if you look in the 90s and the noughties, you had a period when the countries from Eastern Europe joined the EU. So in the vast majority of situations, countries joined for political reasons. And that wasn't the case really for the UK in 1973. It's worth remembering that people think of New Zealand as a relatively young country often, but it's a very old democracy, and the UK's is an old democracy. And we didn't join for reasons of entrenching our democracy, we joined for reasons of economics. And some of those reasons changed. And I'm happy to take questions later on some of what happened last year, but the focus today will be more about what's going on now and what's going to happen in the future. So I'm just going to come on to sort of 3 or 4 things. First of all, some general principles about how the government is approaching Brexit and what we want to achieve from it. Then a little bit about the issues that are going on right now in terms of the negotiation between the UK and the EU. Then focus a bit more on the future trading relationship that we wish to have with the EU. And then finally talk a bit more about the UK and New Zealand in the aftermath of these issues. So, first of all, the future relationship and our objectives going into the negotiations. The British people voted to leave the institutions of the EU, but the UK is not leaving Europe. We want, as the Prime Minister set out just last week in Florence, a deep and special partnership with the EU, taking in both economic and security cooperation. The government's objectives for Brexit were laid out in the White Paper earlier in the year. The Prime Minister's Article 50 letter, that's the letter she wrote in March, triggering the process for departure, her Lancaster House speech in January, and her speech last week in Florence. And we want to achieve the right deal for both people in the UK and across the EU. And we want to deliver a UK at the end of this which is stronger, fairer, and more outward-looking than ever before. In terms of our relationship with the EU, we want a deep and special partnership, one that reflects our shared history and values, one that works for all parts of the UK, our overseas territories and Crown dependencies, and one that delivers for the special circumstances around the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, because nobody wants to see a return to a hard border. It will be, we hope, a partnership like no other. It will be underpinned by ambitious agreements on free trade and customs, covering goods and services, and seeking the greatest possible tariff and barrier-free trade. It should also include a broad security agreement, covering all aspects of our current collaboration, including defence and foreign policy, justice and home affairs, law enforcement and counter-terrorism. And we intend it to be supported by continued cooperation and open access in highly regulated areas such as aviation, financial services, data, transport, and nuclear issues. The UK and the EU share important values. The UK has helped to create a strong, secure, and prosperous EU that supports freedom, democracy, equality, and the rule of law, and we want this to continue. Both during and after our withdrawal, we will be supporting an EU that projects our shared interests and values. This will help us build a deep and special partnership for the future. Europe is, of course, the birthplace of modern democracy, and we have not fought hard to protect our values. And we have fought hard to protect our values. While our future relationship will not replicate membership, ongoing deep cooperation based on those shared values can help forge a successful partnership between us. We will remain a full member of the EU until we leave. From energy and foreign policy to the single market and security threats, the UK will continue to cooperate and provide our full support. And the challenges that the UK faces, counter-terrorism, global security, economic growth, are ones we share with the EU. We want to be the EU's closest friend and partner. And while we remain a member of the EU, let me stress that this means that we continue to support a really ambitious EU-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. The UK has played an integral role in supporting EU external security priorities, from fighting piracy off the Horn of Africa to being a leading contributor in the EU's response to the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. The UK has also been at the forefront of using sanctions as a strategic foreign policy tool. We want to continue that collaboration and will establish our own national legal framework. And we recognise that as we negotiate our withdrawal, the EU will continue to deal with its core challenges such as trade, migration, and Russia. And that's why we want to ensure a smooth withdrawal process which does not distract the EU from its other priorities. So in the Prime Minister's words, this must be a partnership that works for the EU just as much as it does for the UK, reflecting our shared interests and values. Our relationship with the EU cannot seek to replicate membership. Both we and the EU are clear on that. But it can deliver strong and deep cooperation across a range of issues, including trade and security. A small word on just negotiations and implementation before I go into some of the issues that are being tackled right now. We're determined to get on with the job. Last night, this week actually, has been the fourth round of negotiations between David Davis, the Secretary of State for exiting the EU, and Michel Barnier, the lead Commission official on this. We want to deliver certainty to people and businesses as soon as possible across the EU and the UK. Both parties want to achieve the best possible outcome and the strongest possible partnership. And we've set out on a solid foundation for future discussions with an ambitious but achievable timetable. We want to have reached agreement about our future partnership by the time the 2-year Article 50 process has ended in March 2019. But as the Prime Minister said last week, we will be probably looking for a transition period between 2019 and probably 2 years after that. In putting into place a transition agreement, we want to avoid a cliff edge scenario as we move from our current relationship to our future one. This will allow people and businesses in the UK and EU to adjust in a smooth and orderly way to the new arrangements. I'll come on now to some of the individual issues at stake in the current negotiations. And I'll pick on 3, but if you want to cover more in questions, I'm happy to do that. First, citizens' rights. EU citizens in the UK are incredibly valued members of our communities, just as UK nationals abroad are in theirs. They have made and continue to make significant contributions to the economic, cultural and social life of the UK. We want to provide as much certainty as possible to the 3 million EU citizens in the UK and around 1 million UK citizens in the EU. Our goal is that people should be able to continue living their lives broadly as before. We want to reach a reciprocal agreement for EU citizens in Britain and UK nationals in EU as quickly as possible. And that's why we published our position paper to outline our fair and serious offer for EU citizens just over the last 2 months. And as a side, I should just mention over the month of August and early September, there were 14 position papers that were released by the UK, which you can find on gov.uk. If you do want detailed understanding of our positions across a whole range of issues, do look at those, please. Just this week, there were further advances in this issue. The UK offered the EU a guaranteed right of return for settled EU citizens in the UK in return for onward movement rights for UK nationals living in EU 27 countries. And that offer was put to the EU this week. And when it comes to enforcement, there's been a question about how a deal of this nature would be enforced, given that we will be leaving the EU and not be bound by the European Court of Justice. And the government said this week that we will incorporate any agreement struck on EU citizens into UK law to make sure that the agreement has certainty for everybody.